Good afternoon, colleagues. Welcome. And before we commence, for those attending in person, please make sure you sign up the attendance sheet at the entrance if you haven't. This will ensure that you receive a certificate after today's session. Greetings to everyone present here and joining us from around the world. Welcome to the BBL Building Bridges for Land Episode 7. I'm Song Kim at the G20 Global Land Initiative Coordination Office, GLI, of the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, UNCCD, and I'll be your host today. Did you know that many research findings highlight the economic advantages of land restoration? According to these studies, the return on investment for ecosystem restoration can vary from 7 to 110 US dollars for every dollar invested. And this is thanks to the benefits derived from ecosystem services. And this perspective drives today's event titled Restoration Business and Finance, Realizing a Land of Opportunities. And during this event, we will further explore the potential within the expanding field of land restoration. Furthermore, as an extension of these engaging sessions, we're delighted to share that G20 GLI will be present at COP28, the 28th Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The G20 GLI will be hosting a number of events at the Land and Drought Pavilion from 30 November to 12 December. For more updates, please follow us on our social media channels on LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. Today's agenda includes an introduction of speakers sitting next to me, each of whom will share their expertise and insights on land restoration from a financial perspective. Following the presentations, we will move into Q&A session, where we will open the floor for our audience to ask their questions to our speakers. So without further ado, allow me to present our esteemed speakers for today's session. Our first speaker is Dr. Helen Ding, the Senior Environmental Economist at World Resources Institute, WRI. Dr. Helen Ding heads WRI Europe's Equitable Economics Innovation Team with the primary focus on advancing WRI's research in the new economics of well-being and distribution. She's also a co-founder of a global initiative called the Economics of Ecosystem Restoration, so-called TEER. Dr. Ding has an extensive project experience in diverse regions, including Africa, China, European Union, India, and Pacific Islands, all aimed at promoting human and planetary health while ensuring equitable benefits for vulnerable groups. Today, Dr. Ding will emphasize the importance of landscape restoration and the challenges, opportunities associated with in the context of economics and finance. Dr. Helen Ding, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kim. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, for those who join in the room and also for those who are joining online. It's absolutely my pleasure to be here today to speak about some of the recent thinking at what we're doing at the WRI. So before dive into the topic, for those who are not familiar with the World Resources Institute, we're a global research organization headquartered in the US, Washington, D.C., but we have also regional offices across the world in Africa, in Europe, Asia, China, India, and many other countries. So we're doing research-informed decisions, And restoration is one of our key area of expertise, and we have been working on mapping and also on the economics of restoration and to make the case for increasing total finance. So next slide, please. Before going to the topic, I just wanted to also explain the rationale why do we need to restore. I think it is really important to consider restoration or look at restoration not only from a biological perspective, it's actually an economic opportunity. We have to change our mindset. It's very important. So here I just presented a couple of facts that we wanted to why we wanted to restore degraded land. Land degradation is already causing loss of fertile soil every year, and it affects food security. So 23% of the land is already suffering from reduced productivity, and 10% of the crop yield is reduced of every year. And that has a significant impact on human well-being. And 3.2 billion people are actually put at threats for food security. So this is really stunning facts. But in addition to that, we also know that 50% of the global GDP is actually produced by economic sectors that are rely on nature. So land degradation will cause even further economic losses at the economic scale. So this is really important. It's not just because we want to restore the land per se, but it's to reverse the economic opportunities for the whole economy. Next slide, please. And through our studies, we've seen that restoring degraded ecosystem can bring benefits, and especially in terms of environmental and social benefits, the total benefits outweigh the costs. At every $1 invested, you can generate about $7 to $30 in return. And to restore 150 million hectares, which is the target of Bone Challenge by 2020, you basically can generate $85 billion net benefits returns to the national economy, and also create additional 30 to 40 billion extra income for smallholder farmers, which are really important, and adding more food for close to 200 million people. So it is important for the economy, but also for food security and local livelihoods. Next slide, please. And since the start of the Bone Challenge, the momentum has grown over years. So the latest states is that over 210 million hectares has already been pledged through 74 pledges from 61 countries across the world. And restoration practices can basically improve soil health and lead to a global average increase in crop yields by 2% by 2050. So this is really significant if you think about food security for the global population in the long term. Next slide, please. But the challenge remains. One of the biggest challenge we're facing is the financial shortfalls. Our estimate is there are on average about $300 billion shortfall for financing restoration globally. So if you look at this figure, majority of the funding it actually comes from public financing, and only 10 billion out of the 51 billion that are already put in place comes from private sector. So there's a big room for us to actually work to leverage more private capital into restoration. And this is also the thing that we're trying to work now with the G20 Global Initiative. Next slide, please. And here I just want to unpack slightly about the public benefits versus private cost. So if you think about the Bone Challenge by 2030, the aims is to restore 350 million hectares of degraded forest globally. And estimate shows that it will create And if we look at the nature-based solution investment, and it requires longer time frame, sometimes between 10 to 20 years, sometimes even longer, maybe up to 50 years if you want to restore a damaged ecosystem to a pristine state. And that also adds more, the longer time frame also adds more risks to private capital, because if you compare private investment, they wanted to have short-term returns. Usually they work between 1 year to 3 in order to get financial returns. And, and when we talk about the maturing a tree, it probably will take up to 20 to 50 years. So here, just a graphic to show that at different stages, there are different types of costs are involved. And in the very beginning, they're pure cost, right? And there's no benefits to be realized. And over a couple of years, when the tree starts to mature and you can get more benefits, but then who is going to take up the initial risk and the cost of investment? That's the bigger question that we need to address. Next slide, please. So I don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to run through a couple of solutions that we are currently working on to address those issues. Next slide, please. One idea is basically, as I mentioned, to de-risk investment for private investors to get into restoration. And so one of the things is basically to categorize benefits more clearly. What are the private benefits versus public benefits at what stage? So then you can actually, target at different investors in order to bring them in at different stages of investment to make a more bankable projects. Next slide, please. And in addition, we also need to increase the total share of restoration finance. And as you can see here, restoration finance is oftentimes considered as a subset of the finance for nature or climate, and which is already a subset of green finance, and even a further subset of the sustainable finance. So the bottom line is there's a very small fraction of the total finance going to nature, especially for restoration. And globally, it's probably about less than 6% of the finance goes to restoration. So that's the area where we need to work more to increase the total finance share for restoration projects. Next slide, please. And then we'll also, in order to de-risk investment for restoration projects, we also need to blend finance. So this is an example where WRI has been working in India, and in a specific district in India, we are trying to identify different sources of financing and different channels in order to support the different types of interventions, so that you have a blended finance to come in, build on both public investment in terms of grants, but also working with policymakers to provide more incentives to support restoration and remove some of the perversing investment subsidies, and also trying to make a more economic case for private sectors, a business case for private sectors to come in. Next slide, please. And so I wanted to also touch slightly upon repurposing perverse incentives, especially subsidies for land. We know that there is a huge gap in financing, $300 billion a year. But if you look at the incentives that governments are providing to agriculture in terms of perverse incentives, there are 400 billion per year. So if we're able to repurpose those amount of money to support more sustainable regenerative agriculture practices, probably that can help already fulfill some of the financing gaps, right? And that can generate a lot of benefits. And you can help to reforest and increase biodiversity on the land, and create more ecosystem resilience to adapt to climate change impact, and also improve soil quality and carbon soil organic carbon content in the land. So that generates also more incomes for farmers. This is really important. And I think this is another area that we're trying to work on with other international organizations to see how we can actually move with governments to mobilize more finances to support restoration from the existing budget. So we're not creating more money, but actually just relocating, make it more effective. And with that, I want to thank you again for your attention. And if you have any further questions, feel free to write me an email. I have the email address there on the last slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Helen Ding, for your insights. I would like to stress the importance of landscape restoration, its economic benefits, and the need for increased funding and innovative financing to tackle associated challenges. Online participants, please feel free to type in your questions for Dr. Ding. Thank you. And now I would like to introduce our next speaker, Professor Todd Bendor, who is a distinguished professor of sustainable community design at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. As a director of Odum Institute for Research in Social Sciences, Professor Bendor focuses on enhancing ecological restoration and climate adaptation policies through research and teaching. His work includes using various methods to improve environmental markets, urban growth impacts, resilience policies, and environmental conflict resolution. Today, Professor Bendor will highlight the positive economic potential of land restoration and importance of studying its impacts. Please welcome Professor Bendor.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. It's sunny outside now, so it won't be too long. So I wanted to talk to you today kind of just broadly about how we've started to think about characterizing ecological restoration activities as an industry or even a kind of an economic sector domestically within the United States. But I think a lot of these lessons could be applied much more broadly and in a lot of different contexts around the world. So a few takeaways. The first being that ecological restoration can create a lot of jobs and a lot of economic output. In theory, a lot of these jobs can be local. The second idea here is that we really should ultimately create, maintain, and enhance what we've referred to as drivers of ecological restorations. That is, kind of mechanisms that promote either public sector or private sector investment in restoration. And then the third aspect of this is I think there's a number of opportunities to encourage the transition of declining kind of resource extractive industry jobs towards restoration in many places. Next slide. So the first point here is that economic benefits are not the same thing as economic impacts. So typically we talk about economic benefits as things like ecosystem service value, the kind of the natural capital concept around all of the great things that enhanced kind of natural features actually provide. And I think that there's a huge benefit to looking at that. But in the time I've spent studying this space, I haven't seen, at least my part of the world, a huge kind of policy impact from that. It seems to me that there's a lot to be said for understanding what we traditionally think about as economic impacts in terms of employment and impacts on either gross regional product, national product, and kind of value added to the economy. Next slide. So ultimately, why do we want to study the economic impacts of restoration? So there's, at least domestically, but I think we're seeing this in much of the world, there's an overwhelming narrative that is against increasing stringency of environmental regulations based on their potential to kind of destroy jobs, right? The notion that kind of environmental regulation represents what we call a deadweight loss for the economy, right? You're flushing your money down the toilet by requiring that people who damage the environment actually do something to improve it. And we see this both in the policy narrative. We also see this in the literature, where we're really considering, the costs of regulation in a very one-sided manner. And so ultimately, though, I think it's important to note that in the policy discourse, a lot of people pay attention to narratives around jobs and income. In the United States, there's a huge, very controversial discussion during the last presidential election around what was called the Keystone XL pipeline. This went kind of across the United States. And the estimates, which were incredibly questionable, was that this was going to create tens of thousands of construction jobs and, over 100,000 total jobs in terms of its impact on the national economy. And this got a lot of attention because of these numbers. Ultimately, when this was actually recast and there was a closer look at how these estimates came about, is a dramatically lower actual estimate. But ultimately, I think that, what if we could cast the restoration activities that we engage in or want to engage in terms like this? In the same kind of language. So really considering restoration activities as deriving from an industry, and that industry then could be considered just like any other industry in terms of its economic development efforts, whether they be urban, rural, considering people with different backgrounds, education levels, and so on. And so ultimately, a lot of our studies have really set out to look at kind of what are the redistributive employment and investment effects of specific types of environmental policy. And we set out with the hypothesis that it's probably not a dead weight loss. There's probably some jobs that are created elsewhere. So we had to test this. Next slide. So there's a lot of antecedent to doing this. There's, since 2011, right? Far before that, we've had attempts at estimating, at least in the United States and many other places, the number of jobs created under the kind of green economy. So we recognize this as a source of innovation of looking at renewables, or other kind of environmental technologies. But the problem is that it's been very difficult to look at restoration writ large because it's not actually kind of measured as an industry. Next slide. So part of the problem is we've got to define what the industry is. And this is a fraught task, right? Society for Ecological Restoration has been trying to do this for like 20 or 30 years. We're going to sidestep this whole thing. And what we did was we basically asked companies to tell us if they did restoration. And so we start to basically define restoration around firms engaging in this type of work. And so ultimately, we thought about restoration as efforts to provide ecological uplift that ultimately ended up in a functional ecosystem. So we really didn't consider things like bioremediation, for example, or turning a toxic waste site into a parking lot. We wanted to actually look at the efforts to create functional ecosystems. Next slide. So the first point here is that restoration creates a lot of jobs. So next slide. So this was our findings. This is back in 2015 based on a survey in 2014. So if we talk about the restoration industry, we look at this kind of first row here, the direct effect. So the idea is that the industry, we estimated it domestically employed about 126,000 people. And when you say, oh, how big is that industry? The video game industry is $100 billion. Well, the restoration industry is about a $9.5 billion industry. That's what we found. And ultimately, it had this spillover effect and supply chain effect that made it kind of a larger effect, about $25 billion. And this is actually larger than the coal mining industry. Larger than iron and steel mills. And so really what we discovered was that this is an industry, and there's a lot we can say about it. Next slide. So you can typically look at industries in terms of their kind of efficiency at creating jobs and what kind of jobs they create. So there's been numerous studies on this. We did a study, we published it around the same time, that just tried to review different restoration activities and this kind of job creation efficiency. So if I invest $1 million, how many jobs does that create? And this was kind of all over the map, but we can kind of see the range here. And for comparison, oil and gas, we see about 5.3 jobs. And so just in terms of the numbers, this seems important, right? There's also a question about what kinds of jobs these are and what these firms actually do. Next slide. So we can look at all different kinds of restoration work, if it's financing, legal services, landscaping, supply work, the whole essentially, mechanism, the whole bevy of services that go into actually producing restoration. Next slide. So we looked at this in terms of what's also called the employment multiplier. And so for every job that you create, how many other jobs are created on top of that, either through the supply chain or kind of the ripple effect through the economy. And we found that this was generally, studies had shown for every dollar invested, you essentially created, around $2 in additional economic output. Next slide. Importantly, we saw bifurcation in the types of jobs. And so there's a high share of kind of professional, white collar technical jobs like lawyers and engineers and landscape architects. And on the other end, we saw a pretty high share of physical restoration jobs that required a much lower threshold of education. Next slide. So one of the other things we looked at was drivers of restoration. Next slide. I'm running through these. It's Friday, I think. So one of the important ideas is to look at drivers of restoration. What's actually prompting firms to become involved here? And we categorized this into really 5 chunks. The far and away the biggest was regulatory drivers. So these were essentially markets that have been created by federal regulation into this, including Clean Water Act, which created the oldest environmental market, at least in the United States, wetland and stream mitigation. We also saw public procurement, these kind of regionally focused initiatives, which is still public procurement, but was heavily directed, for example, Everglades restoration. And finally, private investments, right, which really was the Nature Conservancy or other organizations that were raising money to do restoration, which was a small minority of these types of projects. Next slide. So ultimately, we really found that a big thing we need to do is create policies that this kind of policy ecosystem that allows private investment in restoration. So lowering, the barriers, it's much easier in the United States, even though we have this whole mechanism to promote restoration. It's much easier to destroy a wetland than it is to actually restore one. And it remains that way today. There's a lot of literature coming out on, building a wetland restoration project. It's 3 years of permitting on average. And so ultimately, like a lot of the other aspects of the green economy, we see, huge benefits from local champions, early public examples, and ultimately this whole infrastructure for educating a workforce to be able to do this. Next slide. And then finally, this idea of transitioning declining resources. Next slide. Went away. Well, there's the discussion, I'll say, I had a couple of cool slides. There's this larger discussion that's happened. We're far and away not the first people to look at this. I would say that we were some of the first people to look at this on a national scale. There's been a very long-running program at the University of Oregon called the Oregon Ecosystem Workforce Program. And so you've got this large economy based in forestry in rural or the state of Oregon that was declining. A lot of those activities were being offshored to Asia, South America. And so you had this workforce that was essentially ripe to be retrained into doing forest restoration, wetland restoration. You also had a huge amount of machinery, other capital that could be adapted. And so there was a concerted effort to do workforce development in that context. And they did a really interesting job tracking where that money went. Each and every county within the state, projects that were created. And so I think there's a lot to be learned from that type of shift. And we're looking at that in other places in the US, for example, in coal mining, more towards the East Coast, which is occurring in pretty rural, low-income areas. So I think there's a lot of opportunities there. And then I had another slide with a list of all of these, but I think we can distribute the slides somehow. But that has a list of a lot of the publications and just some of the resources of reference. But that's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Bandor, for your presentation. I would like to underscore the substantial impact of ecological restoration in promoting local jobs and economic growth. Hence, the importance of shifting resource industry towards restoration can't be overstated. Once again, thank you, Professor Bandor. And online participants, please type in your questions for Professor Bandor. As we move into the Q&A session, I would like to thank our audience attending in person and online for being part of today's event. We hope you find this talk enlightening and insightful. I would like to first open our floor for our in-person attendees. If you have any questions, please activate the microphone in front of you and introduce yourself, and kindly mention the specific speaker you'd like to direct your questions to. In the meantime, online participants, please type in your questions addressing the speakers.
Yeah, thank you so much. My name is Fabian Rackelmann, a research associate at the United Nations University. If you wouldn't, what would be the 3 top suggestions to national governments worldwide to support the restoration industry in their country? To both of the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Dr. Bandor. Would you like to answer the question first?
Man, on the spot. Let's start off with a small question. I appreciate that. I think so. Risk reduction. We had a discussion about this earlier today. This notion that, I mean, if it's kind of, how do industries locate, right? This whole idea of location choice theory. Is there labor? Is there trained labor? Are there opportunities, right? So facilitating private investment in restoration, we've got to consider how are you getting companies to invest in this? What are those mechanisms? Are those environmental markets? Are these insurance or bond instruments or other kind of creative financing? What kind of risk environment are you creating? So even though I just described what is become an incredibly, maybe overly sophisticated kind of system in the United States, and ultimately we see these growing left and right, water quality trading, endangered species, habitat, conservation banking, all these other things, there's still massive risk for firms that are entering this, and that risk comes from a variety of different places. And so even though we've got that policy ecosystem, it's not been designed in a very useful way to really reduce risk and get as much investment as we think could be happening. So I think that'd be probably one major thing. Maybe even before that is just creating that policy ecosystem. I don't know what the third one is. There we go. Please.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think there are a lot of recommendations we want to make to government officials at different levels. But as Todd mentioned earlier, I think the enabling systems is really important because a lot of private investors wanted to invest, but there's not sufficient regulation, or there's no safeguard for them to invest. There's a high risk for investors to get their return back. So I think that's quite important. But I wanted to emphasize on a couple of other enablers. One is that we wanted to increase public support in a way. Is not just to provide more funding to support restoration in a way that is not profitable, but actually we need to better align government policy goals. So what we have seen is a lot of restoration are taken under Ministry of Environment, for instance, in many countries, which actually, if we if you work with the governments, you know that they are the least powerful within the governments and has the smallest share of the budget. Whereas if you look at restoration, what we do a lot today is restoring degraded agricultural land. On the other hand, the Ministry of Agriculture should also get involved because they have a more share of budget in many countries. So if they can work together, identify common goals, common policy synergies, and they probably could identify area where, you know, certain interventions could be classified as agriculture restoration, but also it's good for the environment. So it's a win-win solution. So how can we identify that area? I think that needs some more work, and we can encourage peer-to-peer learning between governments to actually make good cases, but also learn from the bad examples. And WRI were already doing that for some countries working on to accelerate land restoration. We put together government officials from, you know, different countries to come together to learn from each other. I think that's another way of empowering governments and create more capacity building. The other area I want to emphasize is just to stop financing economic sectors that actually drive more deforestation. And today, we can't just simply pour money to restore ecosystem, to cover up, you know, the damage. We also need to stop financing the activities we know are harmful. And it's not stopping today because a lot of the governments are still providing other subsidies to agriculture practices that are harmful to the soil, and increasing use of chemical fertilizers are damaging soil health. And you will have to invest more to restore that back to their ecosystems. So, you know, that's not really good business to make, right? So that's another thing. And then the last one is, again, on the regulation side of things. So we wanted to also provide the environment where, you know, we can create a market to allow certain types of ecosystem to be treated, and interesting party to come in to actually invest in that environment. The market is not yet created, and you need to put the guardrails to ensure that the players are actually following rules, and not just the bigger private sector can benefit, but particular attention should be given to smallholder farmers who don't really have a say. So how can we actually make sure that those investments are not creating more harm and not only benefiting disproportionately large enterprises, and make sure that, you know, the smallholder farmers were also benefiting from those investment. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Ding and Professor Bendor, for answering the questions.
Hello, I'm Subhash. I'm a PhD student with Center for Developmental Research, University of Bonn. My question is for Dr. Helena Ding. That's interesting knowing those cases. I'm more interested in knowing about, are there cases like what we are referring to, already existing degraded
30 million hectares of land already committed by the African governments, overcommitment. But there's very little land is actually put under serious restoration now. One is because of lack of funding. The government doesn't have money, and they need international support to provide more funding into restoration. And secondly, I think it just because as what you rightfully pointed out, there are land tenure issues in those countries, and we're working with smallholder farmers. 70% of Kenyan farmers are smallholder farmers. We talk about smallholder farmers, they're owner of 1 or less than 1 hectare of land. And how can we make industry at economic of scale to actually make that profitable and attract more private sector? I think that's a big question mark we wanted to look into. But what we have been doing is we help to channel funding from international donors who are interested in this, try to blend projects. Smaller holder projects on restoration probably cost about $1,000 to a few hundred, maybe 50K for a project, not even $1 million. And then on the other hand, we talk about the big investors who hold over $100 million to invest. So there is money available, but the problem is that how can you bridge this gap? How can you actually help educate farmers working at a smaller scale to be able to communicate and actually get access to those finance? That's the question. So I think, what we're trying to do is also to train. We have a program called Land Accelerator. We train enterprises in the local farms who actually doing business related to restoration, and we try to teach them how to communicate and write the proposals to get into the funding scheme so that they can actually have more access to finance. So there are multiple ways. I think the question now is what can we do to accelerate that process to actually help them to meet their 130 million targets of restoration? Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Helen Ding, for your insightful answer. Participants, do you have more questions? Yes, please.
Dear colleagues, first of all, thank you very much for the very interesting reports. My name is Alexey Nazarenko. I have small question to Professor Bendor. You told that ecological restoration can create some jobs, but have you made any calculations, or how do you think how many it can be globally? Of course, plus minus.
Yeah, that's a good question. That's actually what we're considering trying to answer that question in some sort of formalized way. So why is this difficult? Maybe as a useful corollary to sidestep your question. Maybe. So one of the first things is we're looking at firms that are either specializing in this or are doing some sort of adjacent activity. And we're basically asking them, hey, do you engage in ecological restoration? In much of the world, that doesn't exist, right? A lot of the ecological restoration that is occurring or could be occurring through a variety of different, mechanisms would be paying farmers. And so that kind of real tangible number would have to come from some sort of estimate of how those farmers are using money or could use that money. So it's getting those direct payment ideas. There's this question: how much does restoration cost? Well, the cost of restoration is also the revenue of whoever is doing that restoration. And so that includes, materials, labor, profit, all of these different things. And so how is that, organization that's doing the restoration actually constructed? So that's a big question. The other, even if we were to look at this in, developed countries that have, some sort of organized framework for requiring restoration or providing restoration, funding restoration, we need to have an understanding of the universe of firms. And so the way that we've studied this is we've tried to say, let's take a very conservative estimate of who's actually doing this restoration, but folks that we're pretty sure are doing it. And then it's essentially surveying them to get information out of that. And that could become very difficult in different contexts. I think there's a number of methods that we're kicking around for this, but the bigger issue is also we've got some baseline. And so a lot of the work that we've been doing, there's a follow-on paper to what I just presented that looked at a subset of restoration actually more recently that occurs in major environmental market in the US. But if we start theorizing on, hey, what if we do 500 million hectares of restoration? There's some problems that occur in that all of this modeling becomes very stressed by the fact that you're asking about a potential future where that much restoration will require a lot of materials and a lot of labor that may not exist right now. And so we've been using an input-output framework to look at this, to in the kind of current conditions. But the second we change those conditions dramatically, the price of everything changes. And so, the economic impacts of everything changes. So it's this cyclical issue that we haven't been able to tease out and would be very difficult to tease out precisely, even in an environment with a huge amount of data, let alone an area where you'd be exploring this for the first time. So we want to do exactly what you just asked, and I'd love to be able to give you a number, but those are some of the barriers to actually answering that question.
Thank you very much. We'll return to address questions from our on-site audience. And at this point, I would like to open the floor for our online participants. And for this, I would like to invite my colleague Niranjana to facilitate engagement of our online participants. Thank you.
Thank you, Song. I'm Niranjana Nair from the G20 GLI Coordination Office. Before we move on to the Q&A session from our online participants, I would like to point out that we have around 74 participants joining us online. Now we quickly move on to the questions. Dr. Ding, the first question is for you.
Okay.
If restoration is a long-term strategy and an expensive undertaking, how can regulators structure viability gap funding, which is typically used to finance infrastructure projects, especially in public-private partnerships?
That's a very good question. Thank you so much for that question. It is true, and I think this is also the topic that we're trying to figure out the best composition of public and private finance in resolving this problem. And I think one of the figures I showed at the very beginning, there are pure costs, and in order to initiate the project, as in certain places, you might need the public finance to come in first to actually provide that business readiness and test the water and to understand what could be done at that smaller scale. And then the business model has to be developed during that period in order to become more financially viable for private sector to come in and to see the profits, because the cost has to be covered by someone. But then the problem is if it is a long-term business, and if we're not able to turn it into a profitable business, I think that's the challenge. And I think if it's purely business-oriented world, I think we probably would say, let's just drop it. And a lot of the smaller business failed because they couldn't make it more profitable. And I guess that's an area we're working on at the moment. I don't really have a process answer to that question, but I think a lot of organizations are working on this together and trying to see, can we actually also get insurances or other financial institutions who have a longer time frame for their returns, and they also accept lower below market rates of returns. In that case, probably we can also, not just looking at profit driven and the ones that look at above market returns, but also those ones who are willing to sacrifice some of the returns, but looking at more long-term time frame. So those are type of investors we wanted to look into as well. But again, at different stages of the project, you might want to engage different investors, different financial institutions, and to work together to develop a viable financial mechanism. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Ding, for the answer. Now, the next question is to you, Professor Bendo. What strategies do you consider effective in promoting local economic policies to carry out restoration of degraded ecosystems, especially in the Global South?
I have no idea. As someone who has not studied this in the context of the Global South, that's a good question. Well, and as a American faculty member, it's like my responsibility to theorize about stuff I don't know anything about. So let's try. So I'd imagine, one of the important things I think is that these are highly locally specific issues. So I don't know if you can generalize about the Global South and local policy issues around this. I think, what we even count as restoration, what an endpoint to restoration actually looks like. The notion of restoration versus adaptation is, an issue that's undergone a lot of debate in the United States. The idea that you're restoring ecosystems may create really unstable ecosystems. They may have to be adapted to, surrounding environments, either climate changes in, hydrologic regime, a lot of different issues. If there's urban development upstream, so on and so forth. So even in the United States and elsewhere, there are just highly specific policy issues that emerge. And so maybe that's the answer, is there is nothing that can be generalized. And I think you see that with regulations that are, very much localized across the country and across, I think, most places that have large scale restoration programs. So it's not a great answer, but it's
Thank you for the answer. Next is a question for both of you. Is there a rule of thumb or a recommended percentage of the investments that resource extractive industries or land degraders should allocate while planning investments for ecological restoration, which relates to environmental sustainability and conservation efforts?
I think that it might actually be the other way around. We're talking about restoration, we're talking about conservation as an offset for land degradation activities. I think, the question is, are you going to require that land degradation activities be offset? Mining reclamation, for example. So if yes, then there's a payment, whatever that cost may be. I think it's incredibly problematic to try to establish a price point ahead of time, given the fact that there can be wild variability in restoration or remediation costs. I was using this kind of metaphor before, right? Where it's, it's like, I want you to buy me a car, but I'm going to tell you the price of the car, not what features I want. And then you tell me the price. So you shouldn't be specifying a price ahead of time. I think you should be specifying what are the ecological standards of this remediation, or the restoration that's actually being required. If those are high standards, have them be high standards. If they're low standards, okay. But ultimately, I think that that's what's needed to maintain standards. We've seen this as a huge problem in policy in the United States. If you're trying to specify prices a priori, especially over a large land area, you can run into huge problems, especially urban-rural problems. The price of restoration, remediation in one area, especially if it's an urban area, may be many, many times higher. And so if the price is specified, you're going to get very low quality restoration in areas like that.
I think just add on to what Todd just said. For me, it is important to have the regulations in place, but it's good on paper. A lot of things we've seen in reality is there's lack of enforcement of policies, no matter what kind of rule of thumb you put there. If you don't have a law enforcement in place and you don't have a system to actually track and monitor the progress, people just don't have a liability. And as an example that Todd mentioned, if you set up very high standard, people can find a way to, navigate around it. And there has to be a system in place to actually hold those companies accountable when they're making damage to the environment. And probably as an add-on condition, I'm always thinking like, the companies who are doing business, maybe you should ask them like, as an add-on, if you wanted to do this, you have to do XYZ, otherwise you won't get the permission to do the job, to operate your business. But then, I think governments have to put the guardrails and then enforce it to make sure that the policies are being implemented properly. But there's no system at the moment, especially in a lot of the global South countries, and where the policy enforcement is very, very weak, and even the farmers of local communities, they want to do something good for themselves, but then there's no guarantee actually. And at some point the government can come in and take the land away from them. So there are a lot of issues that need to be addressed.
Thank you for your answers, and that's it from me. Over to you, Song.
Thank you, Niranjana. Given our time limitations, we'll take just one more question from our in-person audience. Yeah, sir, please proceed with your question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you to the both speakers for a nice presentation, informative. My name is Sohail Pasha. I work at the UN Climate Change. I have two questions, one to Dr. Helen. It's about if you could point out any tools for assessing needs and planning for developing countries, especially in terms of land restoration. And the other question to Professor Todd is, thanks for the takeaway pointing out at the beginning. It reminds me of Friday, yeah. So my takeaway would be actually, so we have to make business and make money to get this succeed. One of the drivers I see is also to visualize the co-benefits of the activities. So related to that, my question is, if you could point out how advanced the methodologies and tools are to assess co-benefits in the context of US. Thank you.
Okay, I have a very short and sweet answer to your question. We do have a lot of publications and guidebooks looking at how to map out restoration opportunities, and we're still doing that for specific geographies. And we're using satellite data to actually map out land uses and restoration potential for different countries. But we also compare with the ground truthing data to actually understand what has happened on the ground. So that work is being conducted separately. But we recently, it's still in the production space, but we have just finished one report looking at providing a launch pad for practitioners who are interested in restoration creating projects. There it outlines also the preconditions, enabling systems, and type of finances that you can look for, and what kind of interventions you might do. It's still the draft is finalized, and it'll be released soon. It's in the production phase. So, if you could leave your contact, and I'm happy to share that with you when it's becoming ready online. Thanks.
Sure. I think there's a multitude of tools. I know the Ecosystem Services Partnership has listed a huge number of these tools, models that have been created. In terms of regulatory tools, each and every regulatory district, in the case of wetland and stream offsets, as well as the kind of the bespoke standards created for a lot of habitat restoration programs and markets, actually have their own assessment tools that are created. And so those are all specific to the geographies of those regulated spaces. So there's something like 200 of them that have been created. So this massive list, I think there's a whole literature in this space, but the idea is to both look at the quality of baseline ecosystems, as well as the eventual restored ecosystem, what that looks like, and then from there being able to look at co-benefits that are created. But this is this is a space that there's a lot going on domestically, especially with regards to kind of the connection between restoration and kind of natural infrastructure and climate adaptation, and some of the co-benefits associated for adaptation, especially coastal adaptation.
Thank you, Dr. Helen Ding and Professor Todd Van Door, for sharing your expertise and insights on land restoration. And thank you once again, our audience joining us from around the world and on-site, for your active participation. As we're nearing the end of the event, I want to express my gratitude to everyone who made this BVL possible. This includes our audience and our esteemed speakers and our dedicated colleagues for their unwavering support. As we conclude, I want to bring to your attention the upcoming events hosted by the GLI at the Land and Drought Pavilion during COP28, which is the 28th conference of the parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. These events will take place from 30 November to 12 December. So if you're interested, please follow us on our social media on LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. And on behalf of G20 GLI, I wish you all a fantastic day, and thank you and goodbye.